So much has been made about Lane Kiffin and what the Ole Miss offense will look like in 2020. But we haven't talked enough, Brian, I feel like, about what the Ole Miss defense will look like with new defensive coordinators, DJ Durkin and Chris Partridge. Sudu and Rippee, Brian Scott Rippee here with the Ole Miss Spirit. And Brian, I'll let you get this thing started. You covered Ole Miss closer than I did a year ago. The defense was much improved under Mike McIntyre a season ago. Some areas of weaknesses, obviously, but it was a much better defense compared to what Wesley McGriff put on the field 2 seasons ago. Now, how do you think the Rebels take the next step?
It was interesting. We were talking before we were recording, but I was doing a story on the defense the other day for someone, and it kind of looked up, and technically in total defense, they were like a top 45 defense. Now, in the SEC, that doesn't get you anywhere, but you're talking about one that was like, in the one teens, the previous 2 years, or at least in 2018 before that. So a lot of improvement. I think that 3-4 that McIntyre ran suited them pretty well, just because they had fewer responsibilities, covered more space with the front seven. But as far as this year, I don't know what it's going to look like. In terms of like taking the next step, spring football or a practice in general would be helpful in kind of determining all this. You think it's going to be a 4-3 multiple type thing? Like that seems to be general consensus, but they could line up in a 110 for all we know whenever.
All Durkin will tell people is that it's multiple. That's all he'll say.
Exactly. I think it will be a base 4-man front, though. And, in terms of, personnel, I think the biggest change, if it's a change at all, is the guys that you saw were, quote-unquote, outside linebackers in McIntyre's thing last year are going to slide into more of a traditional defensive end role. Not that it was that different last year. And then the quote-unquote DMs, depending on who they are and body type, will probably slide into the interior somewhere on the somewhere at a not nose tackle, but defensive tackle type spot would be my guess. But that's probably a good launching off point, though, right? Because what are they going to look like on the defensive line? Look okay on the outside, on the surface. Question marks on the interior, but very, very little depth.
Yeah, no doubt. Defensive line was a position you really wanted them to come in, and I know it's hard for a new coaching staff to come in and kill it in recruiting, but that was one of those spots you really hoped that Kiffin and all these guys that he hired. I mean, you talk about Partridge and Durkin, two of the best recruiters in the country. Partridge, especially Partridge. I mean, it was a huge deal to get him. Nick Saban wanted this guy, and the fact that Lane Kiffin got him is a big deal. But you expected these guys to come in and give you something on that end, and they weren't able to. Not to their fault. Obviously, it's a hard job to do that. But, that defensive line, especially if you're going to be running a 4-man front, looks a little rough right now, especially with the departure of Charles Wiley. We're going to get to that in a second, but let's break these two guys down. Obviously, both guys are highly regarded on the recruiting trail, so that your future set up well, that they can recruit. Durkin brings a little bit of baggage with him, obviously, but I mean, he's here now. So we just have to break it down as is. He's a part of this Rebels coaching staff. He's a co-defensive coordinator. And in terms of the on-field football product, not talking about other stuff off the field, but on the field as a defensive mind, DJ Durkin is respected by his peers. He has a good track record, obviously has worked with top programs, some of the top coaches in college football. And you look at his reign as defensive coordinator throughout the years, his defenses were really good, scoring defenses, especially and linebackers, obviously, is a strength of his. His linebackers are always really strong. You look at Partridge, similar situation. He was very successful as a high school coach, and then on Jim Harbaugh's staff for years. I mean, he coached Jabril Peppers, who at one point was considered a possible Heisman contender on defense. So, two highly regarded guys that have a lot of work to do. So I know defensive line is kind of the area of concern. In my opinion, so is the secondary. But it looks like they're going to really run their defense through the linebackers. That's kind of the focal point, and it almost does have linebackers. If you're looking at one position of strength on this defense, it seems to be the linebacking core.
Oh, easily. You bring back a healthy Momo Sonogo, your leading tackler, and Lakia Henry comes back. That's absolutely where they're going to be better off. You graduate a Willie Hibbler and a Dante Evans, but that Lakia Henry was kind of the glue that held it all together. And then you have Jacquez Jones, who is kind of becoming a little bit of a vocal type leader in that defense last year when Sonogo went out on punt of the first series of the second game against Arkansas. So he really didn't even get much of a season. I mean, it lasted 4 quarters and a couple minutes. So, that's obviously the strength of it. Defensively, I mean, secondary-wise, I should say. Yeah, I would agree they were the worst secondary in the SEC last year, but you could kind of see signs of improvement last year. They just had to play a bunch of young guys, whether it was for injuries or just a couple of the older guys, frankly, not playing very well. So, you bring back a DeAndre Prince who's a year older. AJ Finley got some some time last year. You've got some younger guys that I played a lot of football last year, kind of took their lumps or whatever, but you're a year older, you're a year more experienced. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're still pretty young there. That and then just kind of your paper-thin defensive line are really kind of your two biggest concerns defensively, and those are two pretty broad and large concerns.
You mentioned all those names. I mean, to me, obviously, yeah, Sam Williams, I guess, was sort of that hybrid guy in the McIntyre defense. But you're right. He'll probably become an end if they are going to run a four-man front. He was the best, in terms of pass rush a year ago, 6 sacks, 9.5 tackles for loss. You mentioned Jaquez Jones. He and Lakia were the leaders in terms of tackles on that defense. I'm really excited to see both these guys take the next step. And I think having a coach that's going to put a lot on them, force them essentially to step up and be the leaders of this defense, probably going to benefit guys like Lakia and Jaquez because they both showed the flashes. They seem capable of handling the SEC really well. But now, with a coach, with two coaches really with great pedigrees, I expect them to take the next step and really lead that Ole Miss defense this year. And they're going to need to, like we mentioned, the interior of that defensive line, losing Benito Jones, losing a guy like Josiah Coatney, that's going to hurt them. So
Austrian Robinson, the list goes on and on, really, right? I mean, you've got Tariqus Tisdale, younger guys, Quentin Bivens, named Ladarius Cox, maybe. He was kind of a little bit in the rotation for a hot second there last year early on in the season. So a lot of that's probably in terms.
And then I think Ryder, if he comes back.
Yeah,
healthy,
absolutely. I think he's going to start opposite of Sam Williams if I had to take a guess today, because you thought it might be Chuck Wiley, but then obviously he transfers. But yeah, I mean, that interior where Benito Jones, Josiah Coatney, and those guys run last year is going to kind of be where presumably question mark, soft spot, whatever you want to call it. That's kind of where it is.
So you mentioned a guy like Bivens. There's Patrick Lucas. There's a couple names there. I mean, who do you think steps up? Someone's got to step up there. I mean, is it going to be Katie Hill? Like, who's going to be the guy?
It's kind of those four candidates, right? The two guys you just named, and then the previous two, Ladarius Cox, Bivens. I mean, some of them are going to play. I don't know how it's going to go, but they're going to play and have to play a pretty good bit. That's going to be interesting to watch if we get a fall camp, is kind of how that develops up there, because at least, like you talk about the weak point in the secondary, at least you know the names. It's the DeAndre Prince, Keidron Smith. You get John Stanley back healthy. Like, you know who they are. Like, in the defensive line, you don't exactly know who it's going to be yet. You have an idea, but lot to be, I guess, proven there.
Yeah, we can't talk about the Ole Miss defense without bringing up Damon Clowney. I know everyone in the last recruiting cycle was really, really excited about this kid. He's cousins with Jadeveon Clowney, so that automatically brings some hype around him. I've seen some national people bring him up. I just think it's an easy name that they can toss out there to bring some intrigue. But should we actually expect Damon Clowney to make an impact as a freshman?
He probably gets a crack at it, but, we were talking about this on Ben's pod the other day. Particularly offensive line is really kind of the position that you really have to build depth, and it's really unfair and almost impossible in some scenarios to ask freshmen to come in and plug and play. Defensive line, it's probably a little bit easier because if you're just physically chiseled, there's a lot you can just go off of that, even if you're not as polished as a pass rusher or whatever the case may be. So not as difficult there, but still pretty steep hill to climb. Like, how many freshman defensive tackles, defensive ends through the years have you seen kind of make a huge impact immediately? So he'll get a crack at it, but again, until we get him on the field, I don't know what to expect.
This is the hardest part about this, about projecting this Ole Miss defense. I mean, it's already hard enough to really talk any sort of college football this offseason because of no spring practice to go off of. But it's especially hard for a unit that loses a lot, and one that was sort of developing. I mean, they were really, turning the tide on that defense a year ago with McIntyre. Now you have a completely new defensive system, new coordinators, everything's new. So it is hard to predict what happens, but I really do think that these linebackers, thank God Ole Miss got these guys out there and they got experience a year ago. Guys like Lakia and Sam and, Jaquez. I believe these guys are really going to lead the way for this Ole Miss defense if they're going to be good. It's going to really fall on them. Like you, I am hoping that the ends can kind of carry the load for Ole Miss as the middle of that defensive line sort of emerges, but it might be a little rough early on for the Rebels, especially maybe stopping the run, plugging up some holes with the lack of experience in the middle of that defensive line.
Yeah, I mean, if there are no games, your points allowed per game goes down automatically, so they got that going for them.
They do, and let's hope we don't get to that point for your sake and my sake.
Man.
In terms of the income, let's hope the football altogether goes on this fall. All right, so final thoughts before we go. How much of an improvement or how much of a regression? Like, what are we thinking for this defense this year? Because I keep going back to the two DCs. I mean, one was a former Division I head coach. One is a guy that's sought after by some of the top coaches in the game. They're both at Ole Miss. They're co-defensive coordinators. It's a pretty big deal, but how big of an impact do you think having them will be for this Ole Miss defense this season?
Pretty big. I mean, it's one of the things that we would have kind of gotten an idea of maybe a little bit in the spring. You still don't see a ton, but it's kind of the power structure is not the right word because that kind of implies there's some sort of conflict. But the dynamic and like how that works in terms of the scheme and which one's responsible for which. And that's going to be fascinating if we do get football. I feel like I get tired of saying that qualifier, but that's going to be fascinating to find out. So, I mean, they're going to benefit from it. This staff was brought in to recruit. They haven't had a lot of time to do that. And each day that goes by with this pandemic, it becomes even tougher to put together a conventional class next year. But as far as on the field, it's just a ton of unknown, and it's going to be fascinating to kind of find out.
Absolutely. It's going to be intriguing. I say this at the end of every one of our little videos is fingers crossed we have a college football season this year. And obviously, if we do, you guys are going to want to be a part of the Ole Miss Spirit. Go to omspirit.com. If you haven't joined yet, do so. There's a lot of great content on there, especially when recruiting heats up. And the staff that Lane Kiffin's assembled, recruiting's going to be fun at Ole Miss again. You're going to want to be a part of the Ole Miss Spirit. So make sure you guys subscribe and go to omspirit.com. For Brian, I'm Sudu. We'll see you guys next time.